So let's talk about your introduction. So typically there are three common rhetorical moves that we make when writing an introduction in an academic paper. We lead into the conversation, we often provide background article references, and then we include a thesis statement. So if you want to think about your paper like a party, and your introduction is when you introduce all the guests at your party to each other. So maybe you might lead in and kind of bring people over, kind of entice them to come over towards you because you want to introduce them. The background article reference is maybe when you're introducing everybody and kind of sharing how they know each other. And then the thesis statement is kind of when you tell them how the party's going to go, what it's going to be about, what we're going to do with this party. So let's look at some common rhetorical moves or strategies for writing an introduction, especially when writing the lead-in and the thesis statement. Now, oftentimes it can be really difficult to get started when writing a paper, and you probably have some rhetorical moves or strategies. I call them your rhetorical crayon box that you are really comfortable with employing. So you probably come into this class with maybe 8 or 12 crayons in your crayon box. But hopefully by the time this semester is over, maybe you've added, now you have 18 or 24 or even 36 crayons in your crayon box. So let's look at some strategies for opening up your paper in your lead-in and in your background article reference. You might introduce a recent or current event. This is often maybe something that's happening in the news that gets your readers' attention because then they also know about what's going on and they're drawn in. You might introduce a recent film or popular media. Maybe you introduce a story or a narrative. This doesn't necessarily have to even be a real person. It could be a hypothetical person that you let your reader know that is kind of a made up example of a person whose experiences would illustrate what you're talking about perfectly. You might include a definition. Now, I'm going to put an asterisk by this because students love to start papers with introductions. When I was 18 and I was in the Rotary Club, we had to do the Rotary four-way test, and we had to have these tests that we had to give a speech about. And I still remember to this day, 20 years later, that I started that speech with fellowship is defined as X, Y, and Z by Webster's dictionary. And I cringe thinking about that because my readers and my audience at the Rotary Club knew exactly what fellowship was. They were in an organization dedicated to that. And so you want to make sure that if you're using a definition to open up your paper, that you're not relying on a definition that your audience already understands, right? Most of them already know what love is, or they know what family is. And so you don't need to define those terms. But if you're using a term that maybe your reader wouldn't know, or maybe the term is maybe controversial, or it's really important that your reader gets that specific definition, then yes, it's appropriate to open up a paper defining your terms. So for example, I was reading an article this morning that was talking about progressive libertarianism. I've never heard of that. I know what libertarianism is, the political movement, and I know what it means to be a progressive politically, but I've never heard of a progressive libertarian. And so I had to read on further to get that definition. That was an important definition. That's an example. So sometimes you want to be careful about opening up a paper with, according to Webster's dictionary. If you do that, I want you to hear me in the back of your head thinking, oh, she said not to do that. I'm going to tell you the other one that I'm going to give you right now. In your entire academic career, you get 2 questions. That's it. 2 questions and 2 exclamation marks. You can't use any more. I will know. So if you open up a paper with a question, that's it. You only have 1 more in your entire academic career. So a better strategy would be to not open up your paper with a question, just because oftentimes you know the answer to it, so state the answer, right? You're in charge here. It's your paper. You state the answer to that question and get us going. Another example of a way that you can open up a paper is to introduce an historical fact or an historical event. I like to start papers that way because I like to open up with kind of here's what's happened in the past. Then the bulk of my paper, the body paragraphs, the discussion sections, I'm focusing on here's what's going on in the present. And then I like to offer in my conclusion where we should look to the future. For me, that just makes a lot of sense to kind of do this past, present, future organization. That's something you could also try to employ from time to time if it works for one of your papers. But you can also open up your paper with research from experts. So, for example, in the rhetorical listening paper, who is the expert that we are citing quite a bit, or whose research that we've been talking about? Well, her name is Krista Radcliffe, and we quote her in the preface of your NCTC custom version of the Hub. And so that would be a scholar or an expert you could start your paper with. Or because your rhetorical listening paper, you want to assume an unfamiliar reader who hasn't necessarily read the essay from This I Believe, you probably might need to introduce that expert or that person to your audience. Thinking about this paper, coming back to the strategies that we see here, you probably will need to employ the strategy of introducing a person's story or presenting a narrative, because this is where you're going to summarize the This I Believe essay for your unfamiliar reader. They haven't read it, so you need to provide them a context for what it's about. And so maybe you open up this paper by summarizing the essay that you read and the essay that you're going to talk about in this paper. You could even do two of those. You could introduce Krista Radcliffe and the idea of rhetorical listening, and then you could provide a narrative if you wanted. All right, so students often think that an introduction can only be one paragraph. And I'm going to tell you right now that that's not always true. Your introduction can be as long as you need it to be. If you're writing an 8-page paper, let's think of that as a really long party with a lot of people. You have to do a lot of introducing. You have a lot of people and a lot of ground to cover, and you can't cover in an 8 to 10-page paper enough context and introduction to get it all in one paragraph. You probably in an 8 to 10-page paper might have 4 paragraphs. And that's why it's okay to start thinking about your paper, not necessarily as introduction, body paragraph 1, body paragraph 2, body paragraph 3, conclusion, but to think of them as sections. Introduction, discussion 1, discussion 2, conclusion. And your introduction for a 4 to 5-page paper might be 1 to 2 paragraphs long. So for this paper, it is okay to have more than 1 paragraph. But if it's a shorter paper, you definitely have a shorter introduction. If it's a longer paper, you definitely have a longer introduction. So let's think about these. So here's what I provided below. I gave you 2 models of introductions that follow these rhetorical moves: lead in, background article reference, thesis statement. Now I did one thing that you have been told that you can't do, right? And I use first person and I telegraph in these papers or in these introductions. And I know you've heard 100 times that you can't do that in your paper. And yes, there are certain situations and contexts in which that is absolutely true. It's not really appropriate to use I. Science papers, like if you're writing a paper or a lab report for science, that's not a good time to use first person I, because the research should stand by itself. But if you're writing a paper that is your theory and your opinion, of course you would use I, right? It's your observations. It would be awkward to talk about yourself and your experiences and not use the word I. And you can also telegraph. You can say, in this paper, I will discuss, or this paper discusses. Now, there are certain situations in which it's less, acceptable. So, for example, a lot of times in literature papers or in literature classes, we don't tend to do that just because it's kind of a little too direct with the reader. We want the audience to kind of come to an understanding about the text more organically and less directly. But sometimes when we're writing papers, it's really important for your reader to know unequivocally what I'm talking about, right? Because if you think about it, if you're writing, procedure manuals, or if you're writing a really long, detailed document and you need your readers to pay very close attention, and they understand, like sometimes you have to telegraph to your reader, like this is really important. You pay attention to this. So I included here for you 3 examples from papers that include first person I or a telegraphing like this in this paper I will discuss. Now you can disregard this lesson if you think it's if it doesn't fit with kind of what you're doing, and that's okay too. But I just want you to have different strategies, that not every rule applies in every context. And in this case, maybe there's some, times when you have to break those rules, so to speak. I just don't want you to get stuck. We're adding crayons to our rhetorical crayon box. All right, so let's look at these models. Now, if you'll notice, I have used this paper then we'll explore in the first one. Now, if you don't like that, I also included an example of how you could revise out those first person telegraphing. I like to start my thesis statements when I'm writing. In this paper, I will discuss and then answer that question, because it's kind of a trick for me in my brain to make sure I have a thesis statement. And then if I know my instructor's not going to like it, I just go and delete it. So here's an example. In this paper, I will explore 2 representations further and discuss how these stereotypes are problematic. I could just revise that to: the representations presented in the film perpetuate stereotypes that are problematic. And to be honest, probably the revised version is a little bit better, but that's okay. It got me. You can't get to Z without going through the first part of the alphabet, right? So let's look at these 2 models. So the first one is a model from a student's paper that she wrote about what's eating Gilbert Grape. So in recent years, we have become much more aware of how important the media is when teaching us about our communities and other people, cultures, and groups. While we like to believe that the media presents us fairly and accurately, it has become clear that the media too often skews our perceptions. Even worse, the media often presents negative and ill-informed stereotypes that can be cruel, destructive, and harmful. One group that is often negatively portrayed in the media are those who are physically or mentally disabled. We often do not think of these negative portrayals as a problem. However, Professor Paul Longmore, a lifelong activist for the disabled and historian in disability studies, writes in his book, Why I Burned My Book and Other Essays on Disability, quote, "People with disabilities are not who or what we have been taught to assume they are. The experience of disability is not what we have been told. We often are told in the media that people with disabilities are burdens, that they are unlovable, or that they are dangerous. And these negative stereotypes are too often presented on the internet, on television, and in film. For example, in one film, What's Eating Gilbert Grape, we see these stereotypes presented in the character of Arnie and his mother. Johnny Depp plays a small-town grocery store bagger named Gilbert, who is the caretaker of his developmentally disabled brother Arnie, played by Leonardo DiCaprio. Arnie is not the only disabled character in Gilbert's life. His mother is homebound because of her obesity, a condition that was the result of her husband's suicide. Throughout the movie, we watch Gilbert struggle to have a life of his own while being Arnie's and his mother's primary caregiver. The film portrays Arnie and his mother as negative stereotypes, that they, like other disabled people, are burdens. This paper then will explore these 2 characters further and will discuss how this stereotype negatively impacts the disabled community. Here's another example of an introduction in which we see the writer, this was a student, who breaks up her introduction into 2 paragraphs. Now notice, just like in the previous example, the green is the lead-in. So notice how the writer opens up the conversation here in the lead-in, talking about stereotypes in the media and the most common negative stereotypes. We see the background article reference here with Paul Longmore, and then we see another background article reference here with the film What's Eating Gilbert Grape. And then finally in yellow, we see the thesis statement. Now, this student might have combined the blue together to make one paragraph. She might have combined, the blue and the yellow to make a paragraph. But when I was reading it, it seemed to make sense the way that she broke it up this way. So I just left it. All right, so sample introduction of the portrayal of the other in popular culture. So notice our lead-in. When you look at a magazine, a commercial, or even a billboard, more than likely you'll see a thin, attractive individual rather than a heavier one. So that's the end of our lead-in. Now we're moving into the background article reference. According to the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, nearly 69.2% of Americans over the age of 20 are overweight or obese. When overweight people are featured in media, it is typically not in a positive light. Usually they are shown as close-up belly shots or in unflattering outfits, exposing their flaws, and are often mocked in images. For example, Caitlin Seda recently writes in, quote, "My embarrassing picture went viral, how a photo of herself dressed in a Halloween costume became a viral internet sensation. Seda had posted a picture of herself as Lara Croft Tomb Raider on her Facebook. Shortly after, some people copied the picture and added the phrase fridge raider to it. The image went viral, and comments on the image referred to Seda as, quote, a waste of space who should go kill herself." Terrible, terrible things. If you read anything about her article, it was just awful what people did to her. The responses to Seda's image illustrate how the overweight community is ridiculed and even threatened for doing nothing more than being themselves. Many people believe that making fun of obese people is not wrong and is socially acceptable. Chelsea Hauer writes in Fattertainment that fat shaming leads many people to fall into depression, become anxious, and develop low self-esteem. Quote, "Researchers have even found evidence that some of the health problems associated with obesity may result from stigmatizing experiences rather than just excess body weight." So, while obesity poses a significant health problem for many Americans, fatness is often just as, if not more, disabling because of society's prejudices against the obese. Because the media has twisted the perception of the overweight and obese community, in this paper then, I will identify two perceptions of the obese: that they are socially awkward and that they are ugly and undesirable. So if you'll notice, this is her lead-in, this is her background article reference, and the yellow is her thesis. And what we know for the rest of the paper is that she's going to use research to show that the media negatively portrays people who are overweight by showing them both as, one, socially awkward, so that's discussion 1, and discussion 2, that it often shows the overweight as being ugly or undesirable. And she's going to show that, and then I imagine in her conclusion, she'll talk about how harmful these stereotypes or these perceptions and images can be for people in their daily lives. So hopefully that gives you some ideas on how to get started on your paper. There's just 3 rhetorical moves to think about: lead-in, background article reference, thesis statement. And here are some strategies to get you started.